up, why is it that you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? So we're all holy, we're all special, and in particular, you remember who was it they were particularly targeting? Aaron, very good. It was Aaron that they were going after. They mentioned Aaron in his role as the high priest. Now the high priesthood, we'll talk about this in a few moments, it's been very costly for Aaron. It's cost him a great deal. What does it cost him?
2 sons.
Very good, 2 sons. That's a price that I'm sure Aaron would have said, I'd rather not do it if he'd known that that's what was coming. But the priesthood, and Aaron has served well. And by the way, I just want to remind you that at the end of the last chapter, when the people were in trouble and they were being struck down by God, there was Aaron between, it says, the living and the dead. And he was making intervention on behalf of the people. And I said, wow. We just don't always appreciate what Aaron was, that Aaron was such an important person. Chapter 17 picks up, and it seems as though God is still talking about Korah's rebellion. Whenever God says to Moses, here's what I want you to do. I want every person, what it means is from every tribe, perhaps the leader of the tribe, to take a rod from their father's house, all leaders according to their father's houses, 12 rods, and write each man's name on his rod. And you shall write Aaron's rod on the name of the rod of Levi. So God is proposing a great test, a rod from each tribe. Tell me what rod? What are we talking about with a rod? George?
It's a part of a branch. It's a twig that comes off.
Okay, it could be a twig that comes off a branch, right?
Some would say, we talked about sparing the rod.
That's right. What would they do with that rod?
Yeah, they spank their kid.
Spank a child, right. A lot of times what's kind of interesting is that whenever God first comes to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses has the rod with him, what was Moses doing? What was he out doing that day? Shepherding a flock, yeah. So a lot of times people think the word rod is the same word that you would use. Have you ever seen a shepherd's crook? A shepherd's crook? What do you do with a shepherd's crook? It's that big mean hook at the end, and what do you do?
Catch sheep.
Get the sheep over here when you're listening, things like that. I've always thought that's fascinating. It's kind of interesting when you read about rods. That's a big deal in the Bible, by the way. Some weird ideas come out from the rod, but let's just say this. Whenever King Charles was coronated King of England recently, they gave him a crown, and they gave him the spear, and they gave him a rod. Because what does a rod symbolize? Leadership, authority, yeah. One of the things it says about Jacob, I don't know if you remember this in Hebrews 11, when it talks about by faith Jacob, and Jacob did a lot of things by faith, but it says by faith Jacob leaned on his rod as he blessed his household. And the Bible says that's an important work of faith, that leaning on it. A rod is authority. In fact, when Jacob blessed his sons, he said to his son Judah that the rod or the scepter would not pass away from Judah. Very interesting point. Go.
What's the difference between rod and staff?
That's a fantastic question, and it's an easy answer. There's no difference. It just depends what kind of Bible we use to describe the word. So a staff, like when David says, your rod, your staff, they comfort me, they're just different words for the same thing. So it's a very good question, and it makes me think of Psalm 23, where he talks about the Lord being my shepherd, and how the Lord's rod is something that guides David. So that's a good question to think about. The idea is the staff, the rod, was both the authority, it was the power, it was all these different things. So you'll notice that every tribe leader had a rod, had a staff, and that was a sign of authority. So God says, I want you to take everybody's rod. He says, and Aaron has Levi's rod. How many rods would that be total? 12 plus Aaron, so which is 13 rods. Yeah. Well, that's kind of funny, because how many tribes are there? There are 13 tribes. We forget that there are 12 sons, but one of the sons is 2 tribes. What I love about this is it's 12, but it's 13, and that's the apostles, right? There's 12, but there's 13. So that's kind of a neat thing there too. So get the 12 tribes, then get Aaron. Aaron brings out Levi's rod, and they're writing a name on this, and they're going to take him in. He says, verse 4, he says, we're going to put him in the tabernacle. And God says, I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to do something. I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to choose who my representative is. Now remember, our high priest, this is important, because this is New Testament concepts. The high priest is the go-between, the chief go-between of whom? Who does he go between?
Man and God.
Man and God, right, Israel and God. The high priest is the go-between between man and God. So it's important. It's a very, very specific, important role. And God says, I'm going to pick the one. Now, by the way, I'll pause for a second. In the New Testament, this statement is super important in the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer says, one of the things about being a priest of God is that only God picks the priest. God is the one who makes that choice, not man. God is the one that picks the go-between. In fact, he makes the point there talking about Melchizedek. When did you have a comment? Or no? And he makes the point about Melchizedek. He says, God made him priest with an oath. That's how God does things. God's about to make his choice known. He says, I'm going to make my choice known by, he says in verse 5, the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. He says, and thus I'll be done with complaints. I hear you laugh. I appreciate that.
And the idea of rod, they're not running out and cutting a branch off.
No, I don't think they are.
They're daily
Right,
rod that's
right.
old and crusty and kiln dried.
Here's what I think.
No moisture, no life in
Yeah,
it.
yeah, right. I think that their rods could be, one person thought that maybe some of these rods go back, Jacob's rod, that a lot of these rods might go back centuries because they were the authority. So very clearly, Al's making a good point for us to remember. These aren't possibly sticks they just cut out. These are things that, can I say dead? They've been dead
Yes.
for years, maybe decades, possibly centuries, because he says it's the rod of Levi. Now I think it's the tribe, it represents a tribe, but the point is maybe it goes back to Levi. That wouldn't be an unusual statement to say.
Would the rod be passed on down the line? Or
It doesn't say it in the Bible, but here's what's interesting. A lot of the Jewish writers in the first century all swore that the rods were passed down. So it's kind of interesting to think, I just wonder when it says the rod of Levi, what if it really was Levi's rod, which would make it nearly 400 years old, So they did think that, but the Bible doesn't say that. Are you going to add something to that, Joseph? Yeah, no, it is a very interesting question. And again, it just represents the idea of an authority. So you all know the story. Next day they come in, God had said he'd make it blossom. And when they came in, what? Well, it had blossomed, but what else?
before fruit?
Yeah, Tacho?
It had almonds on
Yeah.
it?
Got some problems with that? What are some of the problems with that? Number one, Al's already kind of pointed out, these are dead rods. So they shouldn't have been doing anything. What else?
Normally it wouldn't happen that quickly, just.
That's right. So number two, this happened overnight. Number three, Wendy?
Can't have flowers and.
Can't have flowers and nuts on it because the flowers become the nuts. So none of this makes sense. And by the way, God hadn't promised it would bear fruit. He just said it would blossom. But it's blossoming and bearing fruit. Debbie, is that what you're going to say? So that's the shocking thing is they go in there and Moses places the rods before the Lord in the tabernacle. So they all see this. Moses brings them out. And the Lord says in verse 10, bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me lest they die. So kind of interesting the way God words this. God says, I want you to bring it back and I want you to put it away so that I don't kill the people that are complaining. Now, a couple of things here. Number one, it's interesting that this blossoming rod has to be taken away so God doesn't take their complaints. But number two that's interesting is he says in verse 10 that he wants this brought back before the testimony. Anybody know what the testimony is? Testimony, George? It's the Ark of the Covenant. And it's called the testimony here. So I'll give you extra credit if you know this one. What are the three things that are in the Ark of the Testimony? I'll give you a hint. One, Tacho?
Is manna one of them?
Manna is one of them. Very good. In a golden jar.
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, 10 Commandments. And then the third one is, so Josie and Tacho have to split a point there, right? So you have three things that were in that. And by the way, I think that's pretty significant to say, what is it that makes the covenant the covenant? Well, There, you know, the promise of life, the law, you know, the bread of life. I think all these things are kind of profoundly significant. And they're all things that are representative of some of the biggest ideas that there are in the Bible. So I think that that's a pretty exciting thing. But God says, you're going to bring it in. By the way, I got curious and I thought, well, does Aaron use his rod again? And I couldn't find a time where it's specific that it says it did. Now, in the next chapter, Moses and Aaron use a rod. But we're kind of going to assume that this is Aaron's rod. Moses' rod. And by the way, Moses' rod, Aaron's rod is called the rod of Levi. Moses' rod is called the rod of God. I've always thought that's kind of interesting, and I'm not sure that I understand entirely the significance there. Well, go ahead.
When you have fruit trees and you trim the branches off, the suckers off, and they're, you know, maybe the wrong time of year, I've had them where you cut them and thrown them in the wheelbarrow, and they're budding out.
Yeah.
They're still budding out the next day.
Yeah.
I mean, they die quickly off.
I had a stump once where I cut the tree down on one of the big blocks I set aside, and that block sprouted. And I thought, don't you know you're dead? You know, but it didn't do much. I mean, it certainly didn't do much more than just there. Great.
So question, you put the rod in the ark, did it stay with the blossoms and the fruit?
What an interesting question, Greg. I can't even give you a remote guess. Here's what's interesting. It's not mentioned again being in the Ark of the Covenant. I want to say later in 1 Kings, they talk about the Ark one more time, and I want to say the only thing they mention later is that there was the Ten Commandments were in it, but as far as the jar goes, the only thing we know is that in the New Testament, in Hebrews, it'll say that's what was in there. And here we see God saying he put it in there. So it's not going to be mentioned again, but that's an interesting question. Is it just, you know, is there, you know, somebody opens that box and there's an old rotted stick in there, or is it still, you know, miraculously in place? What an interesting idea, you know, and I have no idea what the answer is.
Put in there for a reminder. I mean, it wouldn't be much of a reminder if it
Well,
was just a...
and that's a good point, Greg. Yeah, that's a good point to think about the idea that any time you might say, hey, who's the high priest here? Oh, yeah, look here, here's the stick. You know, kind of curious. There's not an indication they were really ever opening the ark. I mean, I was waiting for somebody to say, well, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, they opened it, it was just dust. But there's not really an indication that they'd ever open the ark again, you know, except when the Philistines did and they all got sick. But, you know, there's not really a strong indication that there was any cause for them to do it, Ryan.
The Jewish people looked inside the ark.
Well, that's right, and they had to play right after the Philistines, didn't they? That's right, that's right. But like I said, I don't think there was ever occasion for them to, that God said, hey, once a year I want you to open the ark. I don't know that there was really a reason for them to open it again.
So Hebrews 9:4 is talking about, it says, which have the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that held manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant.
Yeah.
So it is mentioned in the New Testament.
Right.
But for how long it was in there, we don't know.
Well, and it's interesting because he says, doesn't he say in the next verse that of these things we cannot talk? Is that what he says next?
Of these things we cannot now speak.
Yeah. Now, I think what he's saying is they've been gone a long time when he's talking about them.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure that
Yeah.
people who stole the ark at any time at least took the things that they felt were important.
Right. Well, and what I hate to say is I imagine they opened it up and they threw everything that was in it out and kept, I mean, the top is solid gold, so that would have been
The
impressive.
golden pot,
Yeah, oh, that's right. I forgot the gold pot. Yeah. So beyond that, though, I mean, you know, stones and such, it would have had little excitement to you know, we kind of think maybe Shishak is the guy that took it. The Bible mentions that he sacks the temple for the first time, you know, and that's just about the last mention of the Ark of the Covenant, and that's in the time of Jeroboam, so pretty early on. Anyway, interesting that it gets put here. I just kind of bring up a note that Jeremiah, God came to Jeremiah right away when he called Jeremiah to be a prophet. And he says, Jeremiah, what do you see? And Jeremiah says, well, I see the branch of an almond tree. And the Lord says, well, you've seen well. I'm ready to start working. You know, I'm ready to perform my word. It's kind of interesting. Jeremiah was himself a priest, a descendant of Aaron. And the vision that he draws him out to is to see this almond bud. And he says, I'm ready to draw you to do my job. And I always thought that's kind of an interesting point here. Let's talk a little bit more about Aaron's rod for just a second. Here's your first question. Your first question is, what are some of the miracles that Aaron's rod performed in Egypt. Go ahead.
Well, when I was reading through the whole list, I only came up with 6 that he actually used
Oh.
the rod. Then the rest were
Moses?
were brought in
Oh.
by God.
Yeah.
Because he brought the firstborn death. He said, I will send the...
I'm embarrassed then because, Josie, I found 4, not 6. So, Josie, you beat me. Well done, Josie. I counted 4 when I went back and counted it, but Josie, you've got 6. It's fantastic.
I got the snake, the Nile with blood, frogs, gnats, hail, and locusts.
I didn't get the locust and the hail. That's what I missed. Okay.
It never mentions the rod.
Oh, it doesn't. Okay.
The only time it mentions the rod being a part of the plague.
Interesting. All right, we need a fact checker. Yeah, that's what we need here is a fact checker to look at this. So Exodus 8 talks about the frog. He says he hit the ground and turned the dust to lice. So like I said, I either missed the last 2 or I don't. Well, I don't know. Josie, never admit you're wrong. Just say, well, it's different facts. That's the way.
Well,
you know
maybe
that.
my Bible.
Yeah, that's right. It's a translation difference there.
Yeah, I could do that.
Teresa, you've been real patient.
Yeah.
I saw somebody else. Wendy, did I see you? No. I know I saw a hand. Dee, thank you. Go ahead.
Was it Aaron that struck the rock? That when God
So,
said to
yes.
speak to it?
So it says that the first time at Meribah, that it was Aaron, that was Moses struck the rock. But in the next chapter, it'll say Moses and Aaron struck the rock with the rod. But it doesn't specify whose rod. So I did think about that, Dee, and I thought, well, could that be Aaron's rod? Or my thinking is Aaron gave his rod up in order to he exchanged it for the priesthood, you might say. And so I kind of think that's what happened here. But Tacho?
And also, the Red Sea, wasn't it parted with the rod?
Moses did, yeah, but that was Moses and not Aaron. But yeah, very good, very good, very good.
Well, in chapter Exodus 5 says, the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand, and the channel and the pond will become full of frogs. So
Did it say hand or rod? It said hand, huh?
he said, well, my version says,
Yeah, interesting.
stretch out your hand with your staff over the stream and canals of pond, and make frogs come out of the land of Egypt. So that was...
Interesting. So I have it down in chapter 8, not chapter 5, that he did that, but very interesting. So anyway, I think we got a good sense that a lot of these miracles were accomplished with Aaron's rod. And it's just, again, just a very interesting thing to think about. So a very interesting thing to think about. We kind of talked about this one already. I asked what was the significance of almonds. You guys caught that. One was that we can't have almonds and blossoms. The idea also we could say about the significance of bearing fruit. The idea of a branch that bears fruit. And that's kind of a significant idea as well. I'm going to push the next question to the very end, and we'll come back to it if we have some time, because it's something I like to talk about, but it's the connection of the branch to Jesus, and so we'll talk about that. So moving forward then, let's go to chapter 18. So chapter 18, the Lord says to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear, and I've loved the term that's used here, you shall, and this is the New King James, you shall bear the iniquity related to the sanctuary, and you and your sons shall bear the iniquity associated with your priesthood. All right, first and foremost, what does the word iniquity mean? Sin. So George, does this sound like a good thing? You shall now bear the iniquity of these things. Now, what does God say? What does God say? It is a big deal. It is a serious thing for sure, and it should make them feel uncomfortable. But what does God say when he says that, Teresa?
Well, I'm just thinking that it has to do with the sacrifices
Okay.
that are made for sin.
Yeah, you said it, but what are they making the sacrifices for?
For sin.
For sin. So right away, here's the thing about the temple. Let's imagine that the temple, if the temple were a machine or and think of it, or the temple, not the temple, the tabernacle. If the tabernacle were a machine or like a government entity or something like that, you would say that its purpose is recycling sin. That it's a machine that takes sin and dissolves it. It's a machine that dissolves, or we actually know what it's really doing is it's just covering it up. But it's a sin that's taken care, or it's a place, a machine that takes care of sin. He says, now, This is your responsibility. Sin is now your responsibility. Sin is your responsibility. You and your family and the priesthood. And he says that you're going to bring with you the brethren of the tribe of Levi, the tribe of your father, to be joined with you and serve you while you and your sons are before the tabernacle of witness. Now here's God making this charge. Now here's what's kind of interesting, is that God is making this charge here. And why is it kind of unusual that here is where God, a year and a half, couple of years maybe even more than that at this point. It's kind of hard to peg time, but at least a year or two after they've left Egypt, now God is giving them this charge. Why is it kind of unusual? Why is this kind of odd? Well, when did God choose Aaron as the high priest? You would say Aaron's been high priest now for over a year. We already talked about in Leviticus chapter 11 that 2 of his sons died. The entire book of Leviticus is written out primarily for Aaron and his sons. So it's kind of odd that now God is giving this charge. So why do you think now, years after Aaron has been given this charge, that God is setting this up and charges? So I'll give you a hint. What if it has something to do with what's just gone on? What was Korah seemingly going after? Moses said, I know what you want. You want to be priests. So if God is doing this in response to what all the Israelites did, and I think one of the hints of this is that he says in verse 3 that the Levites attend your needs and the needs of the tabernacle, but they shall not come to the ear of the articles of the sanctuary and the altar, lest they die, they and you also. Why is God giving this charge again? What's God trying to say?
He's making it perfectly clear to everybody who the priesthood is.
Yeah. And I get this sense, here's God, Teresa said it well, making it perfectly clear who his choice is. And by the way, that's what he said, right? In the last chapter, he said, this will put away any complaints. And the next person, as God kind of sums it up, he says, verse 10 of the last chapter, lest they die. God is saying, it's enough. These are my chosen priests. But I would suggest something else. Let's say Gus. We say, Gus, you're a very important person here, Gus. We're going to give you a charge. And by the way, if you mess this job up, we'll kill you. How badly, then, does Michael want Gus's job?
Not very.
I think that there's an element here to say, what you people don't realize is that it's a dangerous thing to be the high priest of God. And I get a sense that maybe some of this conversation is trying to say, when a bunch of people jumped up and said, hey, we're all holy, we can do it, that maybe God is trying to say, not so much to Aaron, because by the way, does Aaron know it's dangerous? We talked about this several times already. How does Aaron know this is a dangerous job? He's buried 2 of his 4 sons. Half of his children had died in service to God in this way. Aaron knows that this is a dangerous job, to come before the living God. And so now God is saying that the point is you bear the iniquity of these things. And if they're mishandled, I think of like a person who's working with nuclear waste. If you mess around handling this, you could kill yourself. You could kill yourself. I always use Gerald as my example of electricity. You mess around handling this, and it will kill you. It'll kill you. So God is trying to make this point clear. You know what's kind of interesting? Of course, when we think of high priest today, we think of Jesus. But we don't appreciate that Jesus was in a difficult position to become high priest. You know, God said, if my son, if the one I appoint stumbles, is the Old Testament prophecy, I'll chastise him. I don't, by the way, don't ask me what that means. I'm not exactly sure, except to say that it was a very fine line that our Savior had to be on to fulfill everything that he was supposed to fulfill. It was a hard thing to be the high priest of God. And a lot of the high priests, you think of Eli, you think of several of the high priests that had tremendous troubles. Eli lost his sons, he dies, not being dedicated to this office the way he should have been. And he wasn't the worst of high priests either. That's what's interesting about him. I think what God is trying to set up here and to make it clear is he says, number one, this isn't the job for everybody. It's a very dangerous job. And you're bearing iniquity. And if people do this wrong, they'll die. And anybody, and by the way, it keeps going on in verse 7, he says it again, you and your sons attend to your priesthood for everything at the altar. Behind the veil you serve. I give you, I love this verse, he says, I give your priesthood to you as a gift for your service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. It's kind of God saying, this is it. This is it. A priesthood is a super special thing, God is trying to say. Kind of interesting, as God goes on to talk about this, I want to jump further ahead. I want to jump all the way up to verse 20 now, kind of make another point. God says, number 2, the Lord says to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, nor shall you have any portion among them. What does this refer to, by the way? Land. This is kind of the first time we're getting this scenario led to us, built to us. God says, by the way, when we get to the land, you don't get any. Now, I'm going to be careful. That's not entirely true. It's not a black and white statement, because what do they get? They get cities. They get cities throughout the land. But he says, you're not going to get it. Why not? Well, God says, because, he goes on to say, I am your portion and your inheritance among the children of Israel. That's an interesting statement that God makes. I'm your blessing. I'm the thing that's going to bless you. And he goes on to say, and I'm going to give the children of Levi the tithes of Israel as the inheritance. So at first it sounds really terrible, but when you start to calculate this, what's he actually saying is going to happen here?
It's going to make them wealthy.
Yeah. He says, you're going to now get the tithes. What's a tithe? 10%. 10%. So, what's kind of interesting, if 12 tribes, and there's 13 total, if 12 tribes are tithing 10%, that's almost more. Now, by the way, here's what I think about the tithing system. I think the tithing system was designed not to give the Levites more, but knowing that people are probably going to give less. That it just kind of was probably more, that's my guess, as to the system here. I don't think they were going to overly profit. I think it was designed to be a little bit more. Tithing today, what's the answer to that? Teresa, what are you shaking your head for? We don't tithe. There's no tithe mentioned in the New Testament. This was a mandatory amount. It was 10% because that's the amount that makes sense to provide for one tribe out of, by 12 other tribes. So it's roughly speaking, by the way, I always like to say, it's also easy to calculate. You ask Daria. Daria's, can I pick any of Daria? Daria's math skills I've wondered about sometimes, but she can always do 10%. That's an easy one, right? And I think that's the point, though. It's not hard to calculate. You could figure out what 1/10 would be. So you have this sense of the ability to figure out something easily. It was an amount that wasn't going to break anybody, but the other genius of it was, if 12 tribes are participating in this, they're going to be able to take care of the 13th tribe. That's what tithing was about. Tithing wasn't about the gifts people give to God, because God would talk about that separately. Tithing was their mandate. The offerings he talks about as he goes on through here, verse 11, verse 12, verse 15, verse 19, all the offerings that they were obligated to give God, these are things that are going to become the tithes of Israel. Verse 24, for the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as heave offering to the Lord, I've given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I've said to them, among the children of Israel, they will have no inheritance. So God's plan is, these people will take care of these things. Anybody have any comments on how this plays out here? Any thoughts or anything you would think about? There's one last thing I want to kind of jump into. As he's talking about these things, he goes on to talk about, and I've just lost my place here, so I have to find the verse with the covenant of salt reference. I've just lost it. Somebody finds it, you'd be my friend.
Verse 19.
Verse 19, thank you very much. He says in verse 19, all the heave offerings of the holy things which the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I've given to you and your sons and daughters with you as an ordinance forever. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord, with you and your descendants with you. Covenant of salt. That's one of my favorite terms in the Old Testament. It's not used too often. probably have two ideas. Number one, God would say several times to the Levites later in the book of Leviticus, or before this in the book of Leviticus, he would say that when you eat this offerings that are brought to you, he says, put salt on them to remind you that this is a gift from God, that this is part of my blessing to you. But I also think that sense kind of draws us a little bit to something Jesus said in Matthew 5, which was what? You're the salt of the earth. Covenant of salt. Some people think that the idea of the covenant of salt too, used, I have a couple, well, at least one of the references it's used later in the New Testament, was kind of a common term back in the ancient times. And I'm kind of careful to say it was not in the Bible, then we're just speculating, but they thought that maybe it had to do with the idea that salt was obviously one of your most valuable things. You probably know that a lot of times, the weight of salt was the measurement of the weight of gold. That's how valuable it was. And the two men made a compact with each other, a covenant with each other. They might take a pinch from their bags of salt and exchange them. And the idea was if you wanted to break the covenant, you needed to get your salt back. And the answer to that was, well, that's not going to happen, because the idea is a covenant of salt is an unbreakable thing. One of the things that I want you to notice here is that when God talked about these things that he was giving to them and the way that these offers were to be brought out and the work that they were to do, he says these are things that are ordinances forever. I don't know if you noticed that several times here in the text. And by the way, if you go back in Leviticus, it's used a number of times, an ordinance forever. I want you to notice that term because I want you to kind of pay attention to that, because that kind of trips a lot of people up. So for example, God says back in Exodus 15, the Sabbath is going to be an ordinance forever. Or that's not the one most people, I'm going to ask you a question, maybe you can read my mind. What do a lot of people misunderstand in the Old Testament, which is called an ordinance forever, and they want to apply it today?
It only lasts until the end of the covenant.
Right. That's what this term means. It's a covenant term. It means that this is something tied directly to the covenant. So Teresa's right. Teresa understands that ordinance forever doesn't mean it goes on forever. Well, there's a church a couple blocks over here, and they meet on Saturday. And what do they say is an ordinance forever? Sabbath, yeah. And a lot of times they'll say, well, wait, it says it's an ordinance forever. Well, what's important to understand is most of the aspects of the law of Moses are called ordinances forever. As I said, the Passover is, the offering system is, several of the sacrifices that are being made are called ordinances forever. And Teresa answered the question here, what does that mean then? Because we know a lot of those things, even if we weren't sure about some of them, we know some of them are certainly past. And the answer is, all of those terms mean to the end of the covenant. Till the covenant is fulfilled. It has no end until the covenant is brought to an end. When we talk about, like, you could even say something like that with marriage. We're going to be married forever. What does that mean? It doesn't mean once I die it goes on. It means till the covenant is brought to an end. And so this term is used a lot of times in the Old Testament. I want you to know that because it's important that a lot of times there's some misunderstanding about these things. Any other comments? Go, Al.
Chapter 18, verse 16, where they're talking about 5 shekels of silver, shekel of 20 gerahs. What is that about?
Okay, that's a great question. So right before this, he says in verse 15, everything that opens the womb of all flesh, whether it's man or beast, has to be redeemed. Now, this goes back to the book of Genesis. Or, I'm sorry, not Genesis, Exodus. This goes back to the book of Exodus. When the Israelites had first come out of Egypt, God was saying that because he had saved the firstborn of Israel from the Passover, he says, the firstborn of everything now belongs to me. Some people see this as maybe God was saying, this will be my first priesthood, will be the priesthood of the firstborn. Priesthood of the firstborn. Then we have the golden calf incident, and God says, no, instead of the firstborn, I'm going to draw it from the Levites. And so we have this change there. And as I said, it's not entirely clear. But this language becomes that because God spared the Israelite firstborn, from now on, the firstborn, like the firstborn child has to be bought back from God because God paid to save that child. He paid with the blood of the Lamb. Obviously, the symbolisms here is very important. What's it saying? Well, the blood of the Lamb is the blood of Christ. You could say the firstborn, the offering of the firstborn, redeems those that are in God, in Christ. And so we have all this language like that. But the idea was that every time an Israelite was born, or every an animal was born, there was a specific amount of money you were supposed to give. Kind of neat. Al brings this up. I'm kind of glad he did. Because if you go over to the book of Luke, what did Mary and Joseph do when Jesus was born? They came to the temple and brought this money because they even were paying for Jesus as their firstborn child. By the way, the Catholic Church says that Jesus was not Joseph's firstborn son, but guess what? Here he's paying for him as though he's the firstborn. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of plays out. But the point is this. This was a practice that they were doing even in Jesus' time because it was the law of Moses that when a child is born or an animal is born and it's the firstborn, that you're supposed to pay this amount to redeem them. And this goes all the way back to the Passover. So does that help to answer that? It's a neat question. It's a really neat question. So let's talk about cows. Because, no evening's not complete if we don't get a chance to talk about cows. Let's go over to chapter 19. The red heifer. The red heifer. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect, on which a yoke has never come. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. He shall take it outside the camp, and it shall be slaughtered before him. Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times directly in front of the tabernacle of meeting. Then the heifer shall be burned in his sight, its hide, its flesh, its blood, its offal shall be burned. The priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast them in the midst of the burning of the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, he shall bathe in water. After it he shall come to the camp. The priest shall be unclean until evening. And the one who burns it shall wash his clothes in the water, bathe in the water, and shall be unclean. Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and store them outside the camp in a clean place, and they shall be kept for the congregation of Israel for the water of purification. It is for the purifying of sin." This one's neat. Kind of hard to understand, but this one is really neat. Right off the top, there's a couple of things that are really weird about this sacrifice. And part of it is, it doesn't really fit into our normal sacrifice system. One or two things about it that are different from any other sacrifice, right at the top. Outside the camp. Actually, there's 3. Yeah, because that is the third one. Number 1, it's not at the altar. Normally it's a bull. This is the only heifer mentioned in the Bible as far as a sacrifice. Normally it's a male, a bull. And this is the only time that it's also specified that it has to be a specific color. So being red, being a heifer, being outside of the camp, nothing else is like this. Nothing else is like this. They take it out of the camp, and instead of doing the normal sacrificial system where you cut it up and you cut off the meat, what are you doing? You burn the whole thing. In fact, you have to keep it burning with all this other stuff that you're laying into it there. Then what I think is so interesting is the priest that did it, what? Yeah, he's now unclean. That's wild. The priest that did this is now unclean. Again, there's nothing like this in another sacrifice. He has to take off his clothes. He has to wash. In fact, then the person that gathers up the ashes, I forgot about that. That the person that gathers up the ashes is unclean too. The person that gathers up the ashes is unclean as well. And it becomes ashes that are going to be brought with water, and they'll be mixed in, and they're called something super special, the water of purification. The water of purification. And so he kind of goes through the rest of this chapter. He gives you this story about when you're unclean and you need to be cleansed. He goes on to describe the idea of this water of purification is something that now has to be brought forth and used to change things. This story is a big part of things that are going on in the book of Hebrews. Can you think of a couple of things in the book of Hebrews that are straight out of this passage? How about when he talks about baptism, he says your bodies have been washed with water, and what has happened to your hearts? They've been purified, sprinkled and made clean. What does he talk about Jesus in at the end of the book? He says, Jesus, our sacrifice, what? Was taken outside the gates. Like this. I think that this, I'll throw you my opinion here. I think that this is one of the best references to baptism that there is. Because what does the water of purification have to have in order to take away sin? Here. It has to have the blood of the ashes, it has to have the ashes of this red heifer. This particularly unusual outside the gate sacrifice. Whenever a person is baptized, we like to say they're not just baptized into water. What are they baptized into? Romans 6 says. The blood, the death, burial, resurrection, the blood of Christ. Like a person being sprinkled with this water of purification, they're being sprinkled with this red heifer, in theory. That it's connection to those things that is this water of purification. And he says if a man, verse 20, says somebody has not been purified this way, they're cut off, they're defiled. Water of purification, if it's not sprinkled on them, it doesn't work. Verse 21, again, here's our term, perpetual statute, everlasting ordinance. And it goes on to talk about this language again, that this was the thing that they were supposed to use. Now, by the way, I have to mention it, that you hear about this one a lot of times in news today, right? So I pulled up 3 or 4 articles about it. So every once in a while, you'll see it pop up in the news that somebody says, hey, we've got a red heifer. Now first and foremost, early in October, I was in cattle country. And I'll say right off the top, there are a lot of red heifers. So I'm not exactly sure what somebody thinks, but every once in a while, somebody says, we've got a red heifer. And so we can restart the temple, because this was a part of the process of restarting the temple. And what's funny is that I found a lot of times where people were saying, hey, we found the red heifer. The one I liked the best was it was a Texas red heifer. So I just like that. I had a picture of a guy, this is the Temple Institute in Israel.